I can't believe I'm actually making this video. I am going to get in so much trouble. Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're doing a video that I've been joking about making for a very long time, which is reading comprehension for pagans. And this video is in response to a loose constellation of issues that I find in a lot of online pagan and witch spaces. These are not unique to paganism, but they're things that come up over and over again. I figure it might be worth talking about. And if you've spent any time on the internet, you've encountered, on Reddit or on Facebook or on Twitter, wherever, you've encountered conversations that go something like this. Hi, I have a question for people who put carrots in their chicken noodle soup. Can you talk about how that changes your recipe? Oh, I put celery in my chicken noodle soup once. It was very good. Okay, sure, but that's not really the question that... I had cream of mushroom soup once. It was delicious. That's great, but the question was about chicken noodle soup, so... Chicken noodle soup is disgusting, and anyone who makes it is a disgrace to the art of cooking. And scene. This is a thing that happens, where you initiate a conversation, and immediately the conversation gets derailed by people who are talking about things that have nothing to do with the original topic. And so part of this video is just an impassioned plea from me for us to all please stop doing that, because it is exhausting. I personally have reached a point where anytime I post any kind of a question on a pagan forum or whatever, I post the actual question with the thing that I'm interested in, and then I post like a 2-paragraph long disclaimer explaining that if you have something to say that's not about the specific topic that I posted, please take that elsewhere so that we can stay on topic, because it happens every time and it's exhausting. So, the first thing that I wanted to talk about is just when you're having a conversation, think about what the topic of the conversation is, and if you have a contribution to make, ask yourself, is this on topic? Is this on the subject of the question that's been asked or the thing that's being discussed? Am I saying something that other people in the thread have not already said, or am I just repeating what others have contributed? And is this question directed at me, right? If someone's asking a question for people who put carrots in their chicken noodle soup, and you don't put carrots in your chicken noodle soup, maybe the best thing to do is just let that post slide on by and not comment on it, which I know is a shocking and untoward suggestion for the internet, but there we go. So that's just getting the first part of the video out of the way. That's just me being salty because it's difficult to have conversations online and nobody's ever on topic, and it makes me sad. But beyond that, there is a sort of a deeper conversation that I do want to have that I think is interesting and valuable and not just me complaining, which is how do we as pagans read critically and engage critically with conversations that are happening in our communities? I started rambling, so I'm going to cut the video and start over with that thought. You see two types of things in particular that I think are instances of reading comprehension not being placed front and center. And the first is that someone will say something, and this is true of authors who say things in books, but it's also true, once again, of social media posts where, someone will make a claim. And people will read into that claim things that aren't actually there. So person A says XYZ, and people will read that, and even though all the post or the book or whatever says is XYZ, people will infer ABC from it, and then go around saying, well, this author says ABC, when in fact, the author doesn't do that at all. This is a thing that people do with Ronald Hutton all the time. People read an agenda into Ronald Hutton's books that is really not there if you read the text carefully. So Ronald Hutton right? Most significantly, we're thinking about The Triumph of the Moon, which is, for better or for worse, his most famous book. But Ronald Hutton writes about the history of modern pagan witchcraft and of Wicca, and he talks a lot about the various influences that converged in the early and mid-20th centuries to allow for this specific type of thing to come into the world. He talks about Freemasonry, he talks about ceremonial strands of magic like the Golden Dawn, Thelema, the work of Dion Fortune. He talks about romantic poetry and visions of sort of going back to nature. He talks about a number of other things that all sort of came and blended together at a particular moment in history that allowed the kind of pagan witchcraft that is Gardnerian Wicca to come into the world. And people read that and think that he's saying, oh, Wicca is all made up and it's bullshit. Nowhere in any of his work does he say that Wicca is bullshit. He points out historical influences that helped shape Wicca, but that's not the same thing as saying that it's bullshit. And so that's an instance of, right, an author makes this claim and people read these things into it, that I think is worth us just taking a minute to sit and dissect. The other thing that happens quite frequently, is that people will make claims, and then those claims get picked up sort of uncritically and spread around without people stopping and thinking about where those claims come from or whether they're substantiated. Witchcraft publishers are trying to be better about this these days, right? This was really an endemic problem in the 90s, and then publishers like Llewellyn and Weiser have been working for the past 2 decades to sort of undo the reputation that they earned for shoddy scholarship and poor history. But it's still a thing you see with certain kinds of witchcraft author, where they'll make a claim totally out of the blue, and they'll say, such and such herb is traditionally used in the invocation. I have to be very careful not to throw shade at anyone particular here, because I have particular people in mind, but I don't want to start a flame war. But, in the invocation of these particular spirits, such and such herb is traditionally used, and sometimes that's something they just pulled out of their ass. Sometimes that's something they just made up. And so it's worth talking, I think, a little bit about how do we read claims that people are making? How do we understand what they're actually saying? And how do we critically evaluate where those claims are coming from and whether they're credible? So for starters, when thinking about reading comprehension, critical reading, this sort of thing, read slowly, read carefully, read multiple times, right? If someone has posted a tweet and you find the tweet outrageous, reread the tweet before you respond to it. Think carefully about not just what it comes across as, but what the author may have been trying to say. Because especially online, people sometimes express themselves poorly. And rather than immediately jumping down someone's throat and assuming that they meant the worst possible thing, it is, believe it or not, sorry, I don't mean to be patronizing. I realize this is a patronizing video, and that's kind of inevitable, but I really don't mean it to be. I would like to have a real sincere conversation about reading skills in the pagan community, because I think it's important. But, rather than immediately assuming the worst, when someone writes something that sort of rings an alarm bell, reread it and think very carefully about the words that they actually said versus the thing that you felt like those words meant. Because those two things can come apart. And the way to think about this is, if someone says XYZ, and what you get out of that is ABC, imagine the conversation in your head where you say, like, hey, you said ABC. If the person comes back to you and says, where do you find that in what I said? Would you be able to point to a quote? Would you be able to point to a place where they actually said ABC? Because if not, you're reading something into the text that isn't necessarily there. And that's true of books as well as of social media posts, right? So if you want to say, Ronald Hutton says Wicca is bullshit, you need to be able to point to a place in Ronald Hutton's books where he actually says Wicca is bullshit. And if you can't do that, then you're reading something into it that's not there. And that sounds obvious, but it's really not. And it's really, really easy for everyone, myself included, to sort of read something and jump to a conclusion about it. And be like, oh, this person says these things. I have whatever kind of preconceptions and baggage I have. And when I see XYZ, I'm used to that being linked with ABC. And so I assume that this person's saying ABC. And maybe being tongue-in-cheek about it or being avoidant, but I assume that ABC is what they're really trying to get across. And it's worth taking the time to sit and question that and unpack that. And it's worth taking the time to really sort of hammer out the actual facts of what a person says and focus on that rather than on what you feel like they said or what you think they meant by what they said. Especially if you're going to get in an argument with someone. It's helpful to focus on the things that they actually said and not on the things that you think that they meant. Because otherwise, you can't get everyone on the same page, right? If you think that someone meant this and what they actually said was that, there's no way that you're not going to be talking past each other when you're trying to have a conversation. And then the other thing, sort of in terms of thinking about critical reading and questioning claims, is when you make a claim, stop and think about or when you see a claim rather, stop and think about where the claim comes from. Who is the person who's saying this? Do they have any kind of credentials? So Ronald Hutton makes historical claims. He has a PhD and is a professor in history, and he cites his sources very carefully. So when Ronald Hutton says something like, Romantic poetry strongly shaped the conception of the goddess Diana in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he has lots of footnotes and quotes and sources to back that claim up. Credibility doesn't have to be purely academic. So, for example, I am a Gardnerian Wiccan. If I make claims about Gardnerian Wicca, like, for example, sex is never a requirement for initiation into the Gardnerian tradition, and it never has been, I have a certain amount of credibility by virtue of belonging to that tradition, by virtue of being a part of the thing that I'm talking about. If I make claims about fairy witchcraft, and I am not a fairy initiate, then I have less credibility, because I don't know what I'm talking about, right? Likewise, if someone who's not a Gardnerian makes claims about Gardnerian Wicca, they might have less credibility than someone who is a Gardnerian, if they're talking about ritual or praxis or theology or training or anything like that. So thinking about who's making the claim is an important thing. And the second part of it is, do they say where they got their information from? So personal experience can be a legitimate source of information, but if you're talking about, this herb is traditionally used to summon these spirits, traditional according to whom? Who says it's traditional? Are you finding this in old folklore? Can you refer to sort of collected folk tales or, a book of herbalism from the 17th century? Is this something that your grandmother told you? Is this something that you came up with yourself? And any of those, depending on the situation, might be a perfectly legitimate source for that information, right? There's nothing wrong with having claims about herb lore or magical techniques or whatever that you came up with yourself. But a lot of the time, and authors still do this to this day, there are authors who really do this, people will make a claim, say it's traditional, and sort of neglect to mention that the tradition they're referring to is one they invented themselves. Will neglect to explain that this thing they're passing off as legitimate and known and established is something that comes from them. And it's totally okay to have magical ideas and innovations that come from you. But if someone is not being upfront about that, that's a little bit of an alarm bell. And if you ask someone, hey, where did you get this claim? Can you show me your sources? They should be willing to show you that. They should be able to show you that. And if they get defensive or aggressive or combative with you when you ask for where the claim is coming from, that's a little bit of a problem. So, I realize that one 15-minute video is probably going to be like 17 minutes, but is not going to change the landscape of critical thinking and critical reading in paganism. Mostly I'm making this video because I've just been so frustrated with various forms of online interaction. But, you know, when you're having a conversation online, think very carefully about what the topic of the conversation is and try to stay on topic and only contribute helpful and substantive information rather than talking about cream of mushroom soup when the conversation's about chicken soup. Read things carefully, read things multiple times, and focus on what someone actually said rather than on what you think they meant. And look at the credibility of people who are making claims and where they're getting their claims from, if you're having conversations where there are sort of divergent claims coming in. Those are sort of the foundational skills that I think, if we're mindful about, can really help us navigate both online conversations as well as, reading witchcraft books and processing the information that we get, because there are a lot of witchcraft and pagan books out on the market, and there are some stinkers among them. There are some really excellent books, but there are some stinkers. And being able to sift through that information and find sort of the good claims and the credible claims as distinct from the shitty made-up ones, well, made up and then passed off as legitimate, right? Like, it's totally fine to have things that are made up as long as you're honest about it. That's a really valuable skill, and it's one that I think serves the witch community well. So I'm going to leave off here. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you sometime soon. Bye.